When you give someone a card you made using the Joseph's Coat technique, they're bound to ask you, how did you do that? And doing the technique is as much of a wow as the finished card. There are a few different ways to do this technique. For example, sometimes you can use a brayer, and in other times you'll want to use a sponge. Now in this case, I'm going to use a sponge to create a slightly softer feel. Let me show you the tools and products you're going to need to do this technique. To begin, you're going to need some ink pads. So in this case, I'm using the Memento Dewdrops in potter's clay, cantaloupe, and bamboo leaves. Now you're also going to need a darker color ink to finish off the card. And make sure that it's darker than your darkest color ink that you start with. So I'm going to use my Vivid Coffee Bean ink. That's the ink that matches our Chocolate Kiss cardstock. Like I said, I'm going to use a sponge and not a brayer. I'm going to use a Versamark pad. I need an anti-static pad to make sure that my cardstock doesn't have any static on it. I'm going to use some Superfine Detail embossing powder by Ranger, and it's the clear. And then you're going to need a chunky stamp. Can't really do this technique as well using a line art stamp. You can do it, but it doesn't create the dramatic results that a chunky stamp will. And you're going to need some glossy cardstock, and I'm using the cardstock that we have in the Gina K Designs online store by Ranger. Okay, so to begin, let me get some scratch paper down first. We're going to start with that piece of glossy cardstock and the lightest color ink. Now I'm just going to do kind of a swirly kind of thing here with the ink. Make sure you can see all those swirls in there. Next, I'm going to go with my potter's clay, and I'm going to be real gentle with this. I'm not going to make definite pounding motions, but I'm just going to kind of lightly swirl some ink through here. You see how I'm doing that? It's like little swirly veins going through. Just like that. And then I'm going to finish it off with my green, the bamboo leaves. And just do the same kind of thing. Real light little bit of waves of color going through. Now, it's best to use dye ink when you're doing this because you want it to dry as quickly as possible, and ink dries slower on glossy paper to begin with. So a dye-based ink is going to be your best bet for this technique. Now you should let this dry thoroughly before you go to the next step, because any little bits of wet ink are going to grab embossing powder. But through the magic of television, I've already done one. And what I did to this one is, you can see I've already used the anti-static pad on that. And what that is when you take the anti-static pad and you just pat over the entire surface, like that, to remove any oils or stickiness or wet anything, so that your embossing powder won't stick to anything except where you want it to stick. And you can see if I started doing that on this one, that would get kind of a softer color too, just like that one. And that'll all go away once we get to the next step. Okay, so the next step is going to be, turn that over. Now I'm going to get my Versamark pad and my chunky stamp, and I'm using one of the leaves from the new Signs of Autumn Stamp TV kit. And you're going to ink that stamp up real well, and just check it if it's the first time you're using it to make sure you've got ink all over it. I'm going to randomly stamp this leaf pattern all over my inked up piece of glossy cardstock. Now you kind of have to look to see where your image is so you don't stamp over it the next time. And stamp there. And I'll stamp right there. Okay. Now I'm going to add my clear detail embossing powder on top. And I'm using this over a scratch piece of paper, which will make it easy for me to get my clear powder back into my jar. And once you've done that, make sure you blow away any excess powder, because anywhere that there's clear embossing powder is going to resist your next step of ink. Okay. Now I'll put that aside for a minute and get the rest of this embossing powder out of the way. And now I'm going to emboss this piece of cardstock. And the leaves, once I hit the card with the heat gun, you're going to see the clear powder is going to start to get shiny, and it'll make the color pop a little bit more. Now because it's small, I'm going to turn it so I don't burn myself. And make sure that clear powder is thoroughly embossed. If there's any areas that aren't embossed, you're going to end up rubbing them away. Okay. Now you're also going to want to give that a minute to dry because the embossing powder is still wet. Next, you're going to take your vivid ink, in this case I'm using coffee bean, and a sponge. And I want to make sure that's dry. You can touch it. If it feels sticky, it's still wet, but if it's not sticky, it's dry. Okay. And I'm going to ink up my sponge dauber, and now I'm going to press ink all over my piece of cardstock. Now can you see what's happening here? You can start to see the leaves are appearing. I'm going to just cover up the entire thing with ink. Now other places where you see this technique, they may use a brayer during this part, and that's fine. You certainly can brayer the brown ink on top. But I like that softer sponged look for the card project that I'm doing. So I just decided to leave it just like that, just kind of a little bit muted. And then your last step, you're going to need a piece of paper towel, and then take the paper towel and go ahead and wipe all over. Now watch what happens. Let's zoom in a little bit here so that you can really see the magic here. Watch this. Look at that. See how pretty that is when you wipe away all the excess? The excess ink is not going to stick to that embossed area, just to the area behind the card. Isn't that pretty? Look at that. Let me show you my finished project. For my card, I used that Joseph's Coat leafy pattern as my focal image and just did a little bit of layering and some embossing with the Cuttlebug. And then I added one of the greetings from the Thanks a Million stamp set. And there you have a beautiful card, very autumn feel to it, very autumny, crisp, just like jumping in a pile of leaves. Try Joseph's Coat using single colors as your base color for a cleaner look, or try stamping a pattern first for another fun variation.